He's the best ever. That's what everyone says about Ric Flair. And now Flair is naming the 10 wrestlers he actually liked working with in the ring. But here's the problem. Flair keeps changing his mind. His lists shift every single time he talks. One year he loves somebody, the next year that same person doesn't even get mentioned. And it causes drama everywhere. So why does Flair keep changing his list? Why can't the Nature Boy just pick 10 names and stick with them? Because even when experts try to create his definitive list, they find a long history of contradictions and shifting moods. Flair's memory moves like water. It changes based on who he's mad at, who he's friends with, and what story he wants to tell that day. Let's dig into this mess. Ric Flair is a legend. Nobody argues that point. His career lasted 5 decades. He worked in Jim Crockett Promotions. He worked in World Championship Wrestling. He worked in the World Wrestling Federation and World Wrestling Entertainment. He even worked in total non-stop action wrestling. That's a lot of years. That's a lot of matches. That's a lot of partners and opponents. But getting a consistent top 10 list from Flair, that's impossible. People have tried for years. Fans argue about it constantly. Wrestling historians study it like ancient texts, and they all came up with something called the Consensus 9. These are 9 wrestlers almost everyone agrees Flair loved working with. The problem is the 10th spot. That spot keeps changing, and Flair himself won't settle it. The Consensus 9 comes from decades of interviews, podcasts, and public statements. These 9 names show up over and over again. They represent different parts of Flair's career. Some are from his early days in the NWA territories. Some are from his peak years in the late 1980s. Some are from his later runs in WWF and WCW. But even with these 9 locked in, Flair still finds ways to mess with the list. Sometimes Flair talks about these wrestlers and leaves half of them out. Sometimes he brings up completely different names. And that creates the core contradiction. If he loved working with these men so much, why does the list keep changing? Why does Flair shift his stories depending on his mood? In 2024, something strange happened. Flair gave an interview where he named his favorite past wrestlers. He mentioned Ricky Steamboat. He mentioned Sting. But then he threw in Wahoo McDaniel, Blackjack Mulligan, and Bruiser Brody. These are territorial guys from the 1970s and early 1980s. They're tough, physical wrestlers who worked the NWA system when it was brutal and demanding. This shift matters. For years, Flair talked about mainstream stars and technical masters. Now suddenly he's elevating the old territorial veterans. This creates tension with the stable Consensus 9. It contradicts decades of prior claims, and it shows a rising pattern of inconsistency that gets worse as Flair gets older. Flair's lists differ depending on the era he's thinking about, the interview he's doing, and his mood that day. When he focuses on NWA territory history, he emphasizes psychology and physical toughness. When he talks about WWF and WCW mainstream years, he emphasizes drawing power and mass appeal. When he discusses pure in-ring work, he focuses on technical skill and chemistry. These are 3 completely different criteria, and Flair bounces between them without warning. This makes getting a definitive answer nearly impossible, but experts tried anyway. They analyzed every interview, every podcast, every public statement. They cross-referenced Flair's words across decades, and they triangulated the names that appear most often with the highest praise. The result is a list of 10 wrestlers that balances Flair's career-long chemistry, his explicit professional praise, and historical significance. But before we reveal that list, we need to understand what Flair actually means when he says he liked working with someone, because Flair uses different terms that sound similar but mean very different things. Sometimes Flair talks about his greatest rivalries. This means long-running feuds that drew money and created compelling storylines. These rivalries prioritize box office success and narrative impact. They're about making fans care and selling tickets. Sometimes Flair talks about the best workers or greatest in-ring performers. This is pure technical assessment. It's about athleticism, execution, and wrestling skill. It's objective measurement of who could perform moves cleanly and safely. Sometimes Flair talks about who he liked working with. This is different from both rivalries and technical skill. This is about chemistry. It's about reliability. It's about how easy it was to produce a great match with that person. This criterion favors specialists who could go the distance in long matches. The question asks specifically about who Flair liked working with. That means chemistry and work rate matter most. It privileges collaboration over spectacle, and that distinction is crucial for understanding the final list. So now let's go through the 10 wrestlers Flair liked working with most. But we're not just celebrating them. We're going to expose the contradictions, the drama, and the tension that surrounds each name. Because with Flair, nothing is ever simple. Number 10, Shawn Michaels. Flair called Shawn Michaels the greatest in-ring wrestler and worker of all time. That's the highest praise Flair has ever given anyone. Michaels performed at WrestleMania 24 in Flair's emotional retirement match. It was a perfect ending to Flair's WWE career. The match had drama, storytelling, and technical excellence. Fans remember it as one of the best retirement matches ever. But here's the problem. When Flair gives shorter lists of his favorite wrestlers, he often leaves Michaels out completely. In that 2024 interview where he named Steamboat, Sting, Wahoo, Mulligan, and Brody, Michaels wasn't mentioned at all, not even once. So Flair says Michaels is the best ever, but then forgets to include him when listing favorites. That doesn't make sense. This contradiction shows how Flair's lists change based on what story he wants to tell. When he's talking about pure technical skill, Michaels is number one. When he's reminiscing about his roots and territorial days, Michaels disappears. The praise is real, but it's not consistent, and that inconsistency creates doubt about everything Flair says. Number 9. Barry Windham. Flair repeatedly called Barry Windham one of his all-time favorite opponents. They wrestled marathon matches that lasted 60 minutes. Sometimes they went 90 minutes. These were grueling technical classics that tested both men's endurance and skill. Windham could work at a high level for extended periods without slowing down. That's rare. That's special. Flair praised Windham explicitly and specifically. He said Windham was one of the best he ever worked with. But then Flair leaves him out of lists all the time. Windham gets forgotten in favor of bigger names with more mainstream recognition. Even though Flair calls him an all-time favorite, Windham often doesn't make the cut when Flair rattles off names quickly. This reveals another pattern. Flair's public lists often favor star power over actual chemistry. Windham was a worker's worker. He wasn't a huge mainstream star like Hulk Hogan, so when Flair is talking to a general audience, he skips Windham. But when he's talking to hardcore wrestling fans, Windham gets elevated. The contradiction shows Flair adjusts his answers based on who's listening. Number 8. Arn Anderson. Arn Anderson was Flair's most trusted partner in the Four Horsemen. They had total professional trust. Anderson's ring psychology was flawless. Their singles match at Fall Brawl 1995 was an emotional classic after Anderson turned on Flair. It proved how much respect and trust existed between them. Anderson could sell a story like nobody else. But Flair's relationship with Anderson has been complicated. They've had falling outs, they've had public tension. In some interviews, Flair barely mentions Anderson. In others, he elevates him to legendary status. The 1995 feud added real-life strain to their partnership, and later conflicts made things worse. This shows how Flair's personal relationships affect his lists. When he's on good terms with someone, they get praised constantly. When there's tension, they get downplayed or ignored. Anderson is undeniably one of Flair's greatest partners, but Flair's shifting praise reveals that personal grudges influence his historical memory. He rewrites the past based on present feelings. Number 7. Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan was the biggest draw in wrestling history. Flair versus Hogan was the dream match of the 1980s. When they finally wrestled each other properly, it generated massive interest. Hogan could get a crowd reaction like almost nobody else. Flair acknowledged having a great run with Hulk, but Flair added a qualifier. He said the run was great when they were allowed to wrestle each other. That implies something held them back. Maybe it was booking. Maybe it was Hogan's control over his matches. Flair's subtle criticism suggests their chemistry wasn't natural. It was great when forced to be great, but not organically excellent. This contradiction shows Flair's complicated feelings about Hogan. He respects the star power and the drawing ability, but he doesn't fully embrace Hogan as a pure in-ring worker. When Flair talks about technical excellence, Hogan often gets left out. When he talks about drawing money, Hogan moves to the top. The inconsistency reveals Flair's internal conflict about whether spectacle matters more than skill. Number 6. Randy Savage. Randy Savage feuded with Flair in both WWF and WCW. Their matches were high quality and compelling. Savage delivered consistent performances and generated significant fan interest. The chemistry was real and produced memorable moments across multiple promotions, but Flair sometimes frames these feuds around himself. He centers the narrative on his own performance rather than the partnership. In some retellings, Savage becomes a supporting character in Flair's story instead of an equal contributor. This shifts how Flair presents Savage's importance depending on the interview. The contradiction shows Flair's ego affecting his memory. When he wants to emphasize his own greatness, partners get diminished. When he wants to show gratitude, those same partners get elevated. Savage's placement on the list is secure, but how Flair talks about him changes constantly. That inconsistency creates doubt about the sincerity of the praise. Number 5. Terry Funk. Terry Funk's feud with Flair in 1989 was legendary. Funk pile-drove Flair through a table. They had brutal matches, including a famous I Quit match at Clash of the Champions. The intensity and innovation left a lasting mark. It was one of Flair's most important feuds outside of title programs. But Flair's praise for Funk fluctuates wildly. Sometimes Funk is prominently featured in Flair's stories. Other times, he barely gets mentioned. When Flair shifts to talking about his modern preferences or territorial roots, Funk gets overshadowed. The inconsistency suggests Flair's emotional connection to the feud varies based on his current mindset. This pattern shows how Flair's storytelling preferences change over time. In the 1990s and 2000s, he talked about Funk constantly. Now in the 2020s, he's moved on to elevating different names. Funk's historical importance is undeniable, but Flair's modern retellings don't always reflect that importance. The contradiction reveals how Flair rewrites history to match his current narrative goals. Number 4. Harley Race. Harley Race was more than an opponent. He was a mentor figure. Their match at Starrcade 1983 officially established Flair as the NWA World Champion and the standard-bearer for the company. Race's legitimacy transferred to Flair through that victory. It was a career-defining moment, but Flair sometimes elevates other mentors and opponents over Race. Depending on the interview, Race might be presented as the most important figure in his career or just one of several important veterans. The shifting emphasis shows how Flair adjusts history based on context. When Flair wants to emphasize his territorial roots, Race gets massive praise. When he wants to focus on later mainstream success, Race gets less attention. The contradiction shows that even Flair's most foundational relationships get reframed based on what story he's telling. Race's importance should be fixed, but Flair treats it as variable. Number 3. Sting. Sting had the longest professional relationship with Flair. They worked together from Sting's debut through the final days of WCW. Their dynamic was the emotional backbone of that company for 2 decades. Flair explicitly credited himself with elevating Sting's career, just as earlier mentors elevated him. But Flair's mentions of Sting are wildly inconsistent. In some interviews, Sting is presented as vital and essential. In others, Flair barely talks about him. When Flair focuses on other eras or other opponents, Sting sometimes disappears entirely from the conversation. This is shocking given how long they worked together. The contradiction suggests Flair's personal feelings about WCW and its legacy affect how he talks about Sting. When he's bitter about WCW, Sting gets less praise. When he's nostalgic, Sting gets elevated. This shows how Flair's emotions color his historical memory. Sting should be a constant in every list, but he's not. That reveals deep inconsistency in how Flair processes his own career. Number 2. Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes was Flair's greatest rival. Their feud defined the NWA in the 1980s. Rhodes was the common man babyface fighting against Flair's aristocratic heel. The chemistry was perfect. The storylines were compelling. Flair confirmed having great chemistry with Dusty and great runs across multiple years. But Flair's retellings sometimes downplay Dusty. Depending on the interview, Flair might emphasize other opponents instead. When he wants to focus on technical workers, Dusty gets pushed aside because he wasn't known for pure wrestling skill. When he wants to talk about drawing power, Dusty comes back to the forefront. This contradiction shows Flair values different qualities at different times. Rhodes should be a permanent fixture in every conversation about Flair's career. But Flair's shifting criteria mean even his most important rival gets inconsistent treatment. The pattern reveals that Flair doesn't have a fixed understanding of his own history. He recreates it every time he tells a story. Number 1. Ricky Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat is the gold standard for Flair's in-ring work. Flair repeatedly acknowledged Steamboat's talent and their great potential together. Their 1989 series of matches is considered a technical benchmark for the entire industry. It represents Flair at his absolute best. The matches are studied by wrestlers and fans as perfect examples of storytelling and execution. But even Steamboat gets excluded sometimes. In that 2024 interview, Flair mentioned Steamboat, but then immediately shifted focus to the territorial veterans like Wahoo McDaniel and Bruiser Brody. When Flair emphasizes physical toughness over technical excellence, Steamboat's importance gets diminished. This final contradiction is the most damaging. If Flair can't consistently elevate the one opponent everyone agrees represents his best work, then nothing he says can be trusted. Steamboat should be untouchable in Flair's mind. But even that relationship gets reframed based on what narrative Flair wants to tell. The inconsistency shows Flair adjusts everything, even his most celebrated partnerships, to fit his current mood and audience. So there's the list. 10 names that represent the best wrestlers Flair liked working with. But every single one comes with contradictions, shifting praise, and drama. Why does this happen? Why can't Flair just be consistent? The answer lies in understanding how professional wrestling history works. Wrestling is part verifiable fact and part storytelling. Wrestlers are trained to work a crowd and tell a narrative. That training doesn't stop when they retire. Flair is a master storyteller. He tailors his retrospective list to fit whatever narrative he wants to push at that moment. When Flair does media appearances, he adjusts his story based on the audience. If he's talking to hardcore wrestling fans who know the territorial system, he elevates guys like Wahoo McDaniel and Blackjack Mulligan. This reinforces his image as a rugged, old-school wrestler who paid his dues in the unforgiving territorial system. It provides authenticity and emotional connection. If he's talking to mainstream fans who only know WWF and WCW, he focuses on Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and Sting. These are recognizable names with broad appeal. This version of the story emphasizes spectacle and star power instead of work rate and technical skill. If he's talking to pure wrestling historians who care about match quality, he focuses on Ricky Steamboat, Shawn Michaels, and Barry Windham. These are the workers who could deliver technical excellence consistently. This version emphasizes chemistry and collaboration. Flair has 3 different versions of his own history. He rotates between them based on context, and that creates the appearance of contradiction and inconsistency. But it's not confusion, it's deliberate narrative construction. Flair is working the audience even when he's just answering interview questions. The 2024 shift toward territorial veterans is a perfect example. By suddenly elevating Wahoo McDaniel, Blackjack Mulligan, and Bruiser Brody, Flair creates a storyline about respecting his roots. He positions himself as someone who remembers where he came from. He emphasizes toughness and physicality over mainstream success. This appeals to a certain type of fan who values the old territorial system. But this shift temporarily displaces other wrestlers who were previously considered essential. Shawn Michaels, despite being called the greatest in-ring worker ever, doesn't fit this narrative, so he gets left out. The inconsistency isn't accidental. It's strategic storytelling designed to connect with a specific audience at a specific time. Flair's podcast makes this even worse. On To Be the Man, Flair discusses his career with more freedom and less filter than in formal interviews. He talks about personal grudges. He settles old scores. He airs grievances against people like Eric Bischoff and Jim Ross. These personal feelings influence which names he mentions and which names he ignores. When Flair is mad at someone, they disappear from his lists. When he's reconciled with someone, they come back. When he's promoting a business partnership, certain names get elevated. The lists become tools for managing relationships and shaping current narratives instead of honest historical assessments. This explains why major names sometimes vanish. Triple H, for example, was a close friend and crucial partner in Flair's later WWE career. But depending on the interview, Triple H might not get mentioned at all. That's not because the partnership wasn't important. It's because Flair's current relationship with Triple H or his feelings about WWE at that moment affect whether the name comes up. The omission reveals that Flair's lists are less about historical accuracy and more about present-day positioning. He uses history as a tool to accomplish current goals. That's smart from a promotional standpoint, but it destroys any possibility of getting a definitive, trustworthy answer. The so-called definitive list of 10 names is really just a synthesized composite. It combines Flair's explicit professional praise with undisputed historical facts. It tries to cut through the contradictions by identifying names that appear most consistently across the longest time period. It's not what Flair would say in any single interview. It's what the evidence suggests when you look at everything together. But even this composite approach has problems. It assumes Flair's most frequently mentioned names are his true favorites. But what if Flair just talks about certain people more because they're more marketable? What if his real favorites are guys he barely mentions because they don't fit his current narrative? The composite list might be more accurate than any individual interview, but it's still based on Flair's inconsistent, context-dependent statements. The 10th spot demonstrates this problem perfectly. Experts spent enormous effort determining whether Shawn Michaels, Big Van Vader, or Curt Hennig should fill that position. Each has legitimate claims based on different criteria. Michaels has the highest technical praise. Vader has the most compelling physical rivalry. Hennig has strong technical credentials and a crucial WWF-era feud. The final choice of Michaels is based on Flair calling him the greatest in-ring worker ever. That superlative is hard to ignore, but Michaels gets excluded from Flair's shortlist constantly. So even the 10th spot, carefully determined through triangulation and analysis, is undermined by Flair's own contradictions. This creates what researchers call the Pantheon paradox. There's a core group everyone agrees on, but the final composition shifts based on criteria, timing, and mood. Attempting to create a definitive list requires choosing which version of Flair to believe, and that choice is inherently subjective. The real issue isn't that Flair changes his mind. People change their opinions over time. That's normal. The issue is that Flair presents each version of his list as definitive and authoritative in the moment. He doesn't say these are his favorites this week or given these criteria. He says these are his favorites, period. Then he contradicts himself later without acknowledging the change. This pattern damages trust. Fans want to believe Flair when he talks about his career, but when the stories keep changing, doubt creeps in. If he can't keep his favorite opponent straight, what else is he misremembering or deliberately changing? The inconsistency spreads uncertainty across everything he says. Flair's memory is also genuinely fading. He's in his 70s. He's had serious health problems. His mind might not be as sharp as it once was. Some of the contradictions might be honest confusion rather than strategic storytelling, but that doesn't make the problem better. It makes it worse, because now fans can't tell when Flair is working them and when he's genuinely confused. The combination of strategic narrative shifting and potential cognitive decline creates a perfect storm of unreliability. Everything Flair says must be cross-checked against other sources. Nothing can be taken at face value. The legend has become the ultimate unreliable narrator of his own history. But despite all these contradictions, the core list holds up. The consensus 9 appears too consistently across too many years to be dismissed. Ricky Steamboat, Dusty Rhodes, Sting, Harley Race, Terry Funk, Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, Arn Anderson, and Barry Windham are genuinely the wrestlers Flair worked best with and talked about most. The 10th spot being Shawn Michaels makes sense given Flair's explicit praise for his technical ability. These 10 names represent the full spectrum of Flair's career. They span from his early territorial days through his mainstream peaks to his final retirement. They include technical masters, physical powerhouses, character workers, and drawing machines. They represent every kind of excellence Flair valued across 5 decades. The list works because it's comprehensive rather than focused on one criteria. Flair's contradictions don't erase these partnerships. They just complicate how we understand them. The matches still happen, the chemistry was still real, the historical impact is still measurable. What changes is only Flair's narrative about those partnerships. The facts remain stable even when the storytelling shifts. This means fans should trust the historical record more than Flair's current statements. Watch the matches, read contemporary reports. Look at what people said at the time rather than what Flair says now. The evidence doesn't lie even if the storyteller does. And Flair does lie sometimes. Not maliciously, but professionally. He works people because that's what wrestlers do. He shapes narratives because that's his training. He adjusts history because that makes better stories. Understanding this doesn't diminish his legacy. It just means his words need verification. The real lesson is that no single source can be trusted completely. Flair's list must be triangulated with other evidence. His praise must be weighed against his contradictions. His explicit statements must be checked against his implicit patterns. Only through comprehensive analysis can you approach something like truth. But even that truth is tentative. Flair could give another interview tomorrow that changes everything again. He could suddenly elevate someone new or drop someone crucial. The list is always provisional, always subject to revision based on Flair's next mood swing or narrative goal. This creates frustration for fans who want definitive answers. Wrestling history should be knowable. The facts should be fixed. But with Flair, nothing stays fixed. Everything moves. The ground constantly shifts under your feet. Trying to pin down his definitive favorites is like trying to grab water. It flows away every time you think you have it. Some fans embrace this fluidity. They enjoy the contradictions as part of Flair's character. The nature boy isn't supposed to be consistent. He's supposed to be unpredictable, adaptable, and always working an angle. The contradictions prove he's still in character even after retirement. He's still the dirtiest player in the game. Other fans find it disrespectful. Flair's partners deserve consistent recognition. Their contributions shouldn't be erased or diminished based on Flair's current feelings. History matters. Accuracy matters. Flair's narrative games dishonor the real relationships and real work that built his career. Both perspectives have merit. Flair is simultaneously a master storyteller and an unreliable historian. He's entertaining and frustrating, authentic and fake, truthful and deceptive. He contains multitudes and contradictions. That's what makes him compelling, but it's also what makes him difficult to trust. The bottom line is this: Flair's list of 10 favorite wrestlers to work with is Ricky Steamboat, Dusty Rhodes, Sting, Harley Race, Terry Funk, Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, Arn Anderson, Barry Windham, and Shawn Michaels. These names appear most consistently. They receive the highest praise over the longest time period. They represent the full breadth of Flair's career and the full range of wrestling excellence. But every single name comes comes with an asterisk. Every placement is provisional. Every bit of praise is subject to reversal. Flair's memory is fluid, his narratives are strategic, and his contradictions are constant. The list is as definitive as possible given the source, but that's not very definitive at all. Flair's shifting lists reveal deeper truths about wrestling history itself. The past is always being rewritten. Narratives are always being adjusted. Facts get bent to fit stories. What we think we know is really just the current version of events, subject to change whenever someone with authority decides to tell it differently. This applies beyond just Flair. Every wrestler who tells stories about the past is engaging in this same process. They're shaping narratives, settling scores, and working audiences even when they think they're just remembering. The entire history of professional wrestling is built on these flexible, strategic, self-serving recollections. Understanding this doesn't mean giving up on truth. It means being skeptical of every source. It means demanding corroboration. It means recognizing that wrestlers are performers first and historians never. Their stories are compelling, but they're still stories. The truth exists somewhere underneath, but you have to dig for it. Flair's contradictions are extreme, but they're not unique. He's just more obvious about it than most. His lists change more dramatically, his contradictions are more glaring, but the underlying problem affects everyone in the business. Wrestling history is always provisional, always contested, and always subject to revision based on who's telling the story and why they're telling it now. So when you hear Flair name his 10 favorite wrestlers, enjoy the story, appreciate the names, celebrate the partnerships, but don't treat any of it as gospel truth. Cross-check everything, look for patterns, demand evidence beyond just Flair's word. Only then can you approach something resembling accurate history. The definitive list exists because experts did that work. They triangulated sources, weighed evidence, and identified the most consistent patterns. But even they admit the list is provisional. It's the best answer available given current information, not an eternal, unchanging truth. That's the real lesson here. Flair can name his 10 favorite wrestlers, but the answer you get depends on when you ask, how you ask, and what mood he's in that day. The nature boy is still working everyone, even himself. The game never ends. The contradictions never stop, and that's exactly how Flair wants it.